are people so fascinated by murder and by serial killers?
Do you know, statistically, the research says that's because mostly it's women. So there's a higher number of women who love crime TV, crime reading, particularly over 30s to 50-year-olds. So a lot more compassion, nurturing, a lot of empathy. And I always think that true crime fans genuinely are the complete opposite to psychopaths and yet can have the same insight. So basically, when I do a test with people and I ask them to spot the victim, all of my true crime fans can do it almost instantly, and so can a psychopath. They can see vulnerability. So I think that the reason that I love it and the reason that people enjoy watching it isn't because they're voyeurs who want to think about the dark side of life. It's that they feel it is such a stretch to imagine that kind of behavior existing in a human being that they're fascinated to understand it. So that's the key. They will never be able to cross the bridge to doing actions that those individuals who cause so much pain do. So they kind of want to be able to be guided through those kind of true crime experiences to understand to a deeper level something that they would never, ever have in their own personality.
And it's very often women who make the best crime authors, whether it's Agatha Christie, Ruth Rendell or P.D. James.
Do you know what? Yeah. I mean, honestly, women just know how to tell a story, whether that story is a fantasy story or whether indeed it's a dark story about murder, because I think that we understand the layers of human behavior in a way that just because of the fact that we're brought up in a different kind of context on a nurture level, you know, you're bred from being day dot as a woman, you're going to be nurturing and loving and all these empathic things. So you're kind of fueled with it anyway. And then you like to explore the darker annals of behavior. And that's what makes women great at those things. Not that men aren't brilliant too, but I just think we've got a deeper understanding of that kind of psyche than maybe a guy would have. That's my personal opinion anyway.
I tend to back up that analysis, I've got to say. Is there a clear definition, Emma, of what a serial killer is compared to somebody that murders?
Yeah, so it has to be very specific. I mean, there's different belief systems. Some say 2 on separate occasions and there has to be a cooling off period. Some say 3. So whilst you might have a mass murderer who goes and does something horrible like bombs the Manchester Arena, that's a mass murderer. If you look at serial killing, it tends to be up to 3 on separate occasions, but it has to have a cooling off period. Obviously, it could be one person who kills a number of people on one occasion, but there has to be other occasions before they're apprehended. And that would usually use the profiling system that's in the States, so it's FBI. We don't have the same linearity in our profiling system in the UK. We have amazing profilers like David Cantor, for example, but it's not linear. Individuals do it in a certain way, whereas in the American system, we have the FBI organised and disorganised offender. That would make a serial killer if they were an organised or disorganised offender. You would look at that profiling system, but they have to have killed more than once, usually 3 times and on separate occasions.
Yes, and this is different to what would be called a spree killer, which could be somebody that perhaps kills a number of people over 3 days.
Yeah, exactly. Well, a spree killer is really more like a school shooter, for example. That's what we'd expect to categorize as a spree killer. So they kill, you know, a number of people in a certain situation in a time frame that, you know, isn't necessarily very long. There isn't a cooling off period. So like you said, it could be somebody who goes in 6 days and kills 6 people. There still is a serial element to it, but there's not been a cooling off period. We want to see a cooling off period. We want to see planning to some degree as well, because whilst every offender has got organised and disorganised traits, when it comes down to serial killers who are really successful, people like Ted Bundy or Ed Kemper, these individuals tend to have quite an organised way of planning, premeditating, enjoying the fantasy experience before they actually go ahead and carry out the crime, and also being quite organised and diligent in the way that they look at forensics and the way that they create a kit so that they plan taking their own kit to an event. So they've done a lot of work. You know, you could have 2 to 3 years if you were like BTK, so Dennis Rader, Bind, Torture, Kill. You could have like 2 to 3 years where you just enjoy the whole experience of fantasy before carrying it out. So it's different to, as you said, a spree killer, which tends to be planned at some points, but much more instantaneous and reactive to that scenario.
So serial killers are generally not spontaneous, you would say?
Well, it depends. You know, Disorganized serial killers. So let's look at some of the ones where you've got the vampire of Sacramento. To some degree, he initially started just with an idea of killing, but had mental health decline, and he just shot randomly. So he didn't have like that classic MO where there's a plan. He didn't refine it to any great degree. When he ended up carrying out the horrible killings that he did carry out because he felt that he was possessed and he was being poisoned, and if he didn't drink people's blood and ingest organs, then the consequences would mean that he would die. His mental health was a big reason why he acted in the way that he did, but he didn't plan. He wasn't really into a scenario where you could imagine there was a lot of fantasy at play. He was disorganized in the fact that he left handprints, footprints at scenes of crimes, which is terrible for forensics. But because he was so disorganized and chaotic, it meant very difficult to link individual crimes. You know, one person just gets shot when they're doing something in the garden, and then, 6 days, 10 days later, he's completely disemboweled an individual and drank their blood and ate their organs. That is not something as an FBI agent I'm going to be like, oh, this seems like a really linear thing. I can connect these two dots. That's what made it so challenging. So it's a challenge really when they look at disorganized and organized offenders and serial killers per se, because yes, organized offenders plan a lot, and serial killers who are organized, they have spent years perfecting it. The MO changes, so the modus operandi changes. If I'm a serial killer and I want to strangle you, I may find that that's not efficient or effective, or it doesn't give me the fantasy I imagined it would. So I might refine that over time, and I might strangle you a little to make you feel like you're helpless, and then I may stab you because that's more effective at killing, in my opinion. That's how you might feel as a serial killer. So the modus operandi might shift and change, but if there's a signature and a serial killer uses a signature, then it's pretty easy to link. And that signature isn't needed for the death, obviously. It's just needed for the psychological benefit of the person killing.
Are serial killers generally of high intelligence?
Oh, well, you see, that's where we've got a problem. So an organised serial killer, let's look at Ted Bundy 135, Ed Kemper 142, so really high. Standard average is 100. And lots of serial killers who are organised have really high IQs. They're your really scary people because they are individuals who are sane on the whole and essentially can have long-term relationships, are sexually competent, are socially really capable, and tend to have like a job that's skilled. It might not be a high-level job because they have fantasies elsewhere. They spend a lot of time thinking about other things, not really that interested in a career, but nonetheless, they are formidable IQ-wise. The disorganized offenders, not so much. They tend to have a lower IQ than the general population. They tend to have mental decline, mental health issues. They tend to be really socially incompetent, and they tend to be sexually very incompetent as well, i.e. they can't have a relationship. They need to kill you before they can satisfy themselves. So there's a massive divide there. And when you look at the analysis and the way the FBI profile, that's one of the key ingredients of them understanding that narrative of whether they are dealing with somebody who's really bright, really calculating, really manipulative, really capable, and probably very sane, versus somebody who's very dangerous, but acutely disturbed in lots of different ways.
Emma, tell me about the show. It's winning rave reviews. It's called The Serial Killer Next Door.
Do you know what, Mark? I don't read any reviews. You will not be surprised after the last 2 years. I have learned just to ignore anything that anybody says about me. But what I would say is I'm really blessed. I've had good feedback. People have said that they've been good reviews. The main bit to me is just to go out and kind of introduce people to the world of victimology. So, like, can you protect yourself? Is it possible to prevent yourself being killed by a serial killer? What could you do in that situation? But also to kind of go through the big hitters as far as serial killing, what they did, how they did it, why they did it, to look at nature nurture, to look at the key ingredients list that creates a killer, and also at the end of it to do a few cute things that like give people insight into whether they would be able to spot vulnerability. And hopefully this sounds really bad, but I do have quite gallows humor, and I do obviously want to entertain people. I don't want to send people off just feeling absolutely abjectly destroyed by my show. So it has still got an element where I feel that we can still retain some humour, not over the victims, but more about the way that the serial killers thought they were far more superior than the rest of us. Well, that is their undoing.
One review said the show is as entertaining as it is terrifying, which I think sums it up brilliantly.
I appreciate that.
You mentioned that the perennial question about whether serial killers are the way they are because of life experience, or if they were born that way, the whole sort of nature versus nurture. Are serial killers mad or bad? Here's a question that kind of really focuses on that. Is there such a thing as natural evil? Is anyone born evil?
So, obviously, there's lots of conflicting belief systems, but I think what is really profound is probably in the last 10 years to 15 years, they've really started to look at the way that the brain develops and also the impact that particular experiences may have on the brain. So when you look at the scans of serial killers, and this has been done, when they've put them among normal population, and they explore issues that are happening within that brain, they have found some issues with connectivity. So we've got an area of our brain which is like the ventromedial and prefrontal cortex, and that's got to connect effectively with an area called the amygdala, because that's where your instinct is. And for whatever reason, there seems to be kind of a poor connection level there. Now, that could be that the person is born that way. It could be, of course, there could be orbital cortex damage, which is kind of here, and people can have accidents. So to some degree, there could be damage in that respect. But certainly the belief is that in utero, there is a potential where a baby's brain is just soaked in serotonin, which again, serotonin is required for being happy and joyful and all those kind of things that kind of stimulate us. If it's desensitized in utero that way, that also causes issues with neurotransmitters, which means that the neurotransmitters aren't being developed in the way and the level and the number that we'd require to really get stimulus feedback to make us feel like anything really. So imagine being born without that stimulus and then seeking to feel. And if you can't feel very well, because particularly your empathy and guilt area of your brain has been desensitized or connectivity wise is poor, you are going to seek to find reason and ways to feel stimulated. A whole heap of bullying and a general superiority complex, and you've pretty much got a breeding ground for potential abusers like serial killers. But again, not all psychopaths are serial killers. 20% in the corporate world are psychopaths, and they do very well for themselves at the cost of everybody else. Look at what's been happening in recent years. The reality is that psychopaths do very well in certain postcodes with certain parents. So it's got to be all these factors that really activate that particular switch. And to put it into context, the chance of you getting murdered by a psychopath, and you look at general population, you think about 3.9 people out of 100,000 people get killed by murder. Out of that, only 0.1% are actually going to be a serial killer. So that, if you think about 0.00039% is the chance of getting killed by a serial killer. So, but the worst part of it, I'd say, is that you look at the doctors and nurses, for example, like Shipman, they have got the biggest body count of probably most serial killers. So we shouldn't get too comfortable.
Definitely not. And that's the point of your show. Your website is ekenny.co.uk. You're on Twitter as well. I believe it's Emma Kenny TV. How can people buy tickets to the show?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not doing it everywhere at the moment because we don't know what's happening, obviously, with Christmas and lockdowns and whether any of that's going to happen. But if it does go ahead, I've just been in Scotland. I'm going back to Dumfries, Glasgow, Lincoln, Manchester. Just Google serial killer next door and it'll come up with the tour dates. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's been great. My true crime fans are like the kindest people ever. It's just brilliant. I get to hug a lot of people, which is even better.
Yeah, just don't switch the lights out and have eyes in the back of your head.
Yeah.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.